land on which I am based in Melbourne. The session is conducted in English with Arabic language interpretation, so please choose the interpretation channel on the Zoom. This session was planned a few months ago to coincide with the launch of the Iran dossier that my colleague, Dr. Hamid Reza Azizi, and I put together. The first workshop on the Iran regional policy and global agenda was held in October last year. As you are well aware, events in the region move fast and require constant attention. The Islamic Republic of Iran has maintained a hostile foreign policy towards Israel for decades, but had until very recently refrained from open warfare. We have now entered a new era where direct confrontation is not a hypothetical scenario. On 1st of April, Israel attacked Iran's diplomatic mission in Damascus. 2 weeks later, Iran responded with a barrage of missiles and drones at Israel. And over the weekend, we witnessed a limited Israeli response. Both sides claim self-defense. In the meantime, the region is on high alert, and there are serious fears of escalation. On that point, the Middle East Council has put together a series of short pieces on where we are heading. And that page will go on live tomorrow. So I encourage you to visit Middle East Council website again tomorrow. To discuss the evolving dynamics and the implications for Iran's role in the region, I'm joined here by 3 esteemed colleagues and scholars. Dr. Azadeh Zamiri-Rad is Deputy Head of Africa and the Middle East at German Institute for International and Security Affairs. My dear friend, Professor Mehran Kamrava, is Professor of Government at Georgetown University in Qatar and Director of Iranian Studies Unit at Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. And my collaborator, Dr. Hamid Reza Azizi, is Visiting Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs and a non-resident fellow at Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Doha. We shall start with Dr. Zamiri-Rad. Each speaker will have 15 minutes maximum, so please keep it short. I'm keeping time, and I will cut anything beyond 15 minutes. Please save your questions to the end after we finish all the presentations. Azadeh Jan, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Shahram. Many thanks also to the Middle East Council for setting up this discussion and also for organizing this Iran dossier and inviting me to contribute a paper to that dossier. I was very happy to contribute a piece on Iran's foreign policy rise, changing perceptions and change or strengthen global ambitions, a paper that was written months ago. But I think it's very relevant to the current discussion and the dynamics that we see in the region, because in many ways, what we've seen these past weeks and Iran's decision to give up on strategic patience and plausible deniability for this one attack against Israel is a result of these changed perceptions and Iran's strengthened global ambitions. This is at least a thesis that I put forward in this discussion today. So I want to take a step back and look a little bit at the larger picture of changed perceptions and changed Iranian calculus that will hopefully help us better understand current dynamics and current decision shaping in Iran. So let me start with some of the foreign policy successes that we've seen under the Raisi government. And I'm speaking here in terms of self-perception. So self-perceived successes on the foreign policy front for the Raisi government, including, of course, the normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia, meaning that we are now on a path to managing at least escalation, managing conflict, managing crisis around the Persian Gulf. Also, Iran's full membership in the SCO, some path that took more than 15 years to achieve, and Iran's offer, and an offer that it accepted actually, to join the BRICS states and become a member of BRICS Plus. So taking this all in and seeing this against the background of immense external and internal pressure, these seem like quite a bit of foreign policy successes here for the Raisi government, successes that not everybody entirely expected the Raisi government to achieve. So if we look at these kind of pressures, Iran was achieving these at a time of ongoing US sanctions pressure, a very massive one that is still very much in place, additional EU, European sanctions packages over Iran's brutal crackdown of the Women Life Freedom movement in 22 and 23. We've seen this all at a time of critical transition in Iran, where Tehran is preparing for succession at the top of the state, and while Iran was going through internal unrest that had a very high kind of quality, unprecedented in the history of protests that we've seen in the Islamic Republic. At the same time, Iran was also able to expand its nuclear program to a point that we've never seen before, achieving technical abilities and capabilities that we have not seen before. So in the face of external and internal pressure, it seemed, at least in terms of self-perception, that Iran has shown remarkable resilience, remarkable endurance, and even near invincibility. And I think that this also has come with a new sense of global significance and in a way also of self-perceived grandiosity on the international stage. So Iran has not just achieved certain foreign policy feats, but it has been acknowledged in a greater status internationally, at least in its own perception, by being, for instance, becoming a full member of the SCO, by being offered to join the BRICS Plus. So what we see now is an Iran that is far more self-confident, far more assertive, and I think also far more active in pursuing its revisionist goal of a post-Western order. And I think here some of the international developments that we've seen have remarkably impacted Iran's kind of vision and perception and conceptualization of how the world is changing and what role Iran can play in that changing world. So Supreme Leader Khamenei has for years claimed that the world, the global order, is already in transition and the center of power is moving from the West to the East. And over the years, he has come up with a number of indicators that could, indicate that this transition is already in place. And I think 4 of these indicators are worth looking at. One is the transfer of economic, political, cultural, and also military power from the West to the East, something that we can already observe in some areas, most notably, of course, with the rise of China. Then there is, of course, this perceived decline of the Western Hemisphere by Iran, perceived decline of the United States, of Europe, both being engaged in a costly war with Russia over Ukraine. Then there is the decline of Israel, something that Iran perceives to be very much in place after the October 7th brutal attack by Hamas. And then there's also this idea of a new rise of regional and global powers, most notably Iran being such a power on the rise and China being such a power internationally on the rise. And lastly, the 4th indicator that Khamenei has strengthened over the years has been an expansion of the axis of resistance, an expansion of its capacities, an expansion of its members. And this, again, is something that we have been witnessing with the so-called Houthis, for instance, now being a self-declared member of the axis of resistance. So in a way, all these 4 indicators seem to have fallen into place if we look at these 4 factors that Khamenei has identified over the years. So again, from an Iranian perspective, what we see is a world that is in a changing process, a world where Iran has now a chance to have a shaping impact on how this order may evolve in the region and beyond. And this has been strengthened by some of the external developments that we've seen. First of all, by Russia's war against Ukraine, meaning that Moscow, for the foreseeable future at least, is going to be decoupled from the West. We are on a trajectory to new kind of block building procedures with the Eastern Hemisphere, offering far more chances for Iran to cooperate and strengthen cooperation beyond the tactical level with some of these Asian partners, such as Russia and China. And then there's, of course, the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, which Supreme Leader Khamenei has hailed as an irreparable defeat of Israel and something that is irreversible. So in his kind of perspective, this has been a geopolitical turning point. This is something that does not allow us to go back to the status quo ante. This is a new era of geopolitics, a new era of order in the region and beyond. So taking these things in, we see that the way that Iran is looking into this region today, and even before the attacks, I'm still speaking about the perception changing before Iran decided to retaliate against Israel directly militarily. We see that this changed global environment, this changed regional environment, this higher kind of self-perceived global significance of Iran already had an impact on how it's envisioning the region, how it's envisioning order, and how it's envisioning its own capacities and place to have a shaping kind of role to play here. So in a way, what we see is Iran having the sense that this is a critical point in time. This is a window of opportunity where we have the capacity, and we've shown the capacity through the axis of resistance, that our power is at its all-time high, that Iran's and the axis of resistance's capacity of power projecting is at an all-time high. And this also means, I believe, that Iran is far less risk-averse nowadays, far more assertive, and not as shy and kind of reserved when it comes to risking a broader confrontation with Israel or the United States militarily. And I think this has been reflected in Iran's decision of these past weeks. We've seen an Iran that took a measure that went far beyond anything that Iran was willing to do even a couple of years ago. So overall, we are dealing with a new entity in many ways. Entity in the way that some of the principles that the Islamic Republic held in its security and foreign defense policy have been put on rest, at least for a while. And this also means that the entire conflict dynamic has changed fundamentally. This is not the same conflict dynamic that we've seen in the past. And while we are in a situation where it's still in Iran's best interest to avoid a major military escalation with Israel, and this is something that we've seen both actors try to prevent, both on the Israeli side and the Iranian side, but still be in Iran's best interest to avoid it, we might in the end still end up in a situation where this conflict becomes a military conflict of much greater proportion. So in my point of view, I think the gravest danger, given these changed perceptions, given these changed international and global conditions, lies in Iran's overconfidence, in Iran's kind of over-exaggeration of its own foreign policy space, of its own capacities, of the capacities of the axis of resistance, and out of this idea that we are at a critical juncture in regional power dynamics, at a critical geopolitical juncture, also globally. And this is a time where Iran is willing and in its own kind of conviction also capable of playing a shaping role far beyond the roles that we've seen in the past. I think this rise by Iran is somewhat exaggerated. There's a lot of miscalculation. There's a lot of over-exaggeration, but this is precisely where the danger lies. And I think this is something that we have to keep in mind moving forward, even now that we have overcome this one hurdle of a more dangerous escalation. This is not over, and I think that the dynamics have changed for good. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zamiri-Rad, for keeping to time. The really good point raised there. I'm sure we can come back. We will be coming back to all these points during the Q&A. I also note that in the chat function, now we have the address for the dossier. So if you like to access the full dossier, you can click that link. But without further ado, let's move on to Professor Kamrava for his take on the dynamics. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here, and I want to thank my good friend Shahram and the Middle East Council for this opportunity and for organizing this very timely event. I was asked to say a couple of things about Iran's good neighbor policy. I think it's important to bear in mind as we speak, there's an ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing underway, and that more than 33,000 Palestinians have died, and there's no let-up. And so within the context of an ongoing genocide, I think we need to be mindful of the fluidity of international dynamics. Even the United States, which has been party to Israel's war on Gaza, on the one hand, has just released billions of dollars in continued military assistance, while on the other hand has imposed sanctions on an Israeli army unit, which has been unprecedented. So I think we need to be mindful of very fluid circumstances and context within which our observations and our analyses are taking place and changes are happening. And within this context of a very changing international set of dynamics, Iran has been coming out and trying to officially improve its relations with its neighbors. It has long tried, at least talked about, improving relations with its neighbors. But one of the accomplishments of the Raisi administration, with which Professor Zamirierad alluded to, is the fact that the so-called good neighborly policy has become the official stated policy of the Islamic Republic in conjunction with and complementing the so-called Look East policy. So let me say a couple of things about the good neighborhood policy in general and how then it has manifested itself in terms of Iran's relations with others. First and foremost, the good neighbor policy has been in practice for a number of decades. In fact, some of the examples of this policy go back a couple of centuries, at least one century. But the foundational goal of the good neighborly policy is strategic. Although it is often articulated in grand ideals and in terms of how it's important to maintain friendship or have civilizational commonalities, the fundamental premise of the policy is based on strategic interests. So, and of course, we know that strategic interests change with time, change with circumstances. So, for example, Turkey had a policy called Zero Problem with Neighbors, which was instituted in 2009, 2010. And then before it had a chance to really have meaningful consequences, the Arab Spring happened, and the Arab Spring, of course, resulted in changing strategic objectives on the part of Turkey, and then the policy kind of was abandoned. And along the same lines, another characteristic of the good neighbor policy is that both sides need to be in a strategic position where they would welcome signals and positive approach and a rapprochement with the others. And we see, particularly in the case of Iran, the good neighbor policy has kind of come to gel after 2021, whereas for a long time, Iran was trying to improve relations with its neighbors, or at least claiming to want to improve relations with its neighbors, and it wasn't successful. Things changed, and I'll say a couple of things about those in a minute. But before I talk about Iran's relations with its Arab neighbors, particularly its Arab neighbors to the south, let me say a couple of things about Iran's relations with its non-Arab neighbors. Interestingly, despite significant ideological differences with the Taliban, Iran and the Taliban have been able to come to some sort of modus vivendi. There have been delegations visiting Tehran. There's now trade agreements. There are moves to kind of smooth tensions over water and cross-border trade. There's a significant number of Afghan refugees who are resident inside Iran. And so, again, strategic objectives have drawn the two cases together. Iran and Pakistan is an even better example. These are two countries that within the span of 10 to 14 days sent missiles to each other's territories. But immediately, each capital came out with expressions of goodwill and expressions of friendship. And both are aware that despite their shifting alliances and changing alliances, Pakistan being very close to the United States in terms of its military supplies, very close ideologically and politically to Saudi Arabia, they cannot necessarily afford to have tensions. And Raisi is visiting Pakistan this week, actually, over the next couple of weeks. Same thing with Tajikistan, whose relations with Iran had been darkened because of Iran's purported support of Islamist activists. Azerbaijan has maintained very close strategic and military relations with Israel. Nonetheless, pragmatism has prevailed, and due to pragmatic considerations, the Iranians and the Azeris have Azerbaijanis have put their differences aside and have tried to improve relations. And we see this kind of modus vivendi coming to some sort of agreement to disagree, particularly in relation to Turkey, where Iran and Turkey found themselves on different sides in Syria and again on a number of other occasions. Now, when it comes to Iran's southern neighbors, we remember that as far back as 2019, President Rouhani came up with a proposal called HOPE, Hormuz Peace Endeavor. And he followed it up with actual letters to the King of Saudi Arabia and the King of Bahrain. And there were no takers, because at that time, none of the regional actors found any reason, any strategic gains to be had in improving relations with Iran. But by 2020, 2021, their own strategic calculations had changed. United Arab Emirates had signed the Abrahamic Accords with Israel and didn't want to further antagonize Iran, and therefore sent positive signals to Tehran and embarked on improving relations. Saudi Arabia also discovered, after the attack on Aramco, which commonly is attributed to Iran, that the United States was not going to come to its military assistance if push came to shove, and that it would be better to improve relations with Iran. And of course, we know that Mohammed bin Salman's own domestic objective changed from engaging in international adventures or misadventures of one form or another to reducing international tensions, and in turn focusing inward on delivering the premises and promises of the 2030 Saudi vision. And of course, Bahrain usually follows the Saudi lead on security issues. And so although Bahrain and Tehran, to my knowledge, haven't necessarily exchanged ambassadors, they have resumed flights, and the tensions are now precipitously lower. Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait had long maintained cordial relations with Iran, not very deep, but nonetheless cordial relations. And so those relations have stayed the same. Let me end with a couple of words on future trajectory. Are we likely to see a continuation of Iran's good neighborly policy? Let's not forget that it takes two to tango. And if strategic objectives change, either in Tehran or in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, then we might see changes in the tenor or the nature, substance of relations between Tehran and other regional capitals. It doesn't seem likely over the next couple of years, at least. So in the short run, we're likely to see that at least Iran's relations with its neighbors will remain relatively calm. It was really interesting that before in the lead up to the attack on Israel, Amir Ahmadian called, the Iranian foreign minister, called his regional counterparts and told them that if United States used bases in their countries to attack Iran, those bases would most likely be attacked. And then as a result, we saw that Kuwait and a couple of other countries came out and said they will not allow the United States to use its bases to attack Iran. So at least means of communication, channels of communication have been maintained. Amir Ahmadian calls his Qatari counterpart at least once a week. He is talking to his Saudi counterpart once every 2 to 3 weeks. And this is a huge improvement over the circumstances. So for the foreseeable future, we're likely to see a continuation of cordial, if not necessarily deep relations between Iran and the various regional actors. I'll end there and yield to Shahram.
Thank you so much, Professor Kamrawa. Fascinating to see how relations between Iran and its neighbors has changed. And as you say, strategic interests are changing, alignments are changing. For many years, Iran had tried to establish good ties with some of the neighbors, but now they bore fruit under Raisi. Now it remains to be seen what happens next with impending conflict with Israel. There are, I see, questions coming in thick and fast, but before we get to questions, let's move on to our last but not least presenter, my colleague and collaborator, Dr. Hamid Reza Azizi. The floor is yours. Please unmute.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially it was a pleasure to co-edit the dossier on Iran in the region with Professor Akbarzadeh. And I wish to thank the Middle East Council for providing this opportunity, actually, to have a presentation right after the publication. So my contribution, actually, to the dossier was on a topic that I usually, basically my favorite topic, Iran and Syria. But as many dynamics have changed over the past month, actually, I was thinking maybe I can, what I can do today in this presentation is to, add some sort of follow-up to that paper, in the sense that I'm going to explain basically how we ended up in a situation that Iran and Israel basically started directly targeting each other. And interestingly, it has to do mainly, not solely, of course, to the situation in Syria, and how Israel's campaign between the wars, so-called, has changed over the years. So what is usually referred to as the campaign between the wars is basically an Israeli effort to prevent Iran from establishing a permanent military presence in Syria, and also disrupt the transfer of advanced weaponry to Hezbollah. So in that context, we used to see over the years frequent Israeli airstrikes against targets that are considered to be either used by Iranians or by Iranian proxies, or somehow the convoys, for example, that were said to be sending weapons for Hezbollah. So basically, how it started around 2013, around 2 years after the start of the Syrian war, was based on rising threat perception on the Israeli side of Iran's growing influence toward its northern borders. So we have heard this quite frequently from Israeli officials, and we hear it still these days, that Israel doesn't want to allow Iran basically to establish another Hezbollah in Syria, and to basically close the circle, northern basically circle on Israel by a set of militias. So that was how it started. But between 2013 and 2018, it was more or less low scale operations. 2018 was a turning point in the Israeli campaign for a variety of reasons. So first of all, since the end of 2017, as we witnessed the gradual demise of the so-called ISIS Caliphate in Iraq and Syria, basically 2017 being the official end of the Caliphate. At the same time, Iran and Russia helping the Syrian government to reestablish its control over, most part of the Syrian territory. The threat of Iran basically establishing itself increased on the Israeli side. And around the same time, of course, and as a result of the same developments, Iran managed to establish that land access through the Al-Ghaim Al-Bu Kamal corridor to border crossing connecting Iraq to Syria, and that actually increased speculations about Iran using Syria as a corridor for arms shipment to Israel. So a very significant development in 2018 was the Israeli attack on T4 airbase in Homs, where several Iranian military personnel, including, of course, IRGC personnel, were killed. So basically, what happened in April, just less than a month ago, April the 1st, in the attack of the consulates, that wasn't the first incident of a number of IRGC personnel being killed. And by the way, that wasn't the first time that Iran responded directly. In May 2018, Iran fired 20 rockets at the occupied Golan territories via the Syrian territory. So that tit for tat basically was a signal that the Iranian-Israeli confrontation centered around Syria was basically entering into a new phase. So that was basically a significant moment, as I said. But what is very important here, and that was in place until 2022, until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was the role of Russia as a sort of de-escalator between Iran and Israel in Syria. So basically, the function, the role of Russia was in a way to act not only as a de-escalator, but also as kind of a channel through which Israel would sort of signal and inform beforehand the Iranian side of its attack. Beforehand, I mean, in many cases, it was just a few minutes before, of its intent to target some bases, some places. So for two main reasons, of course. First of all, because, for the sake of not targeting Russian citizens and entering into an unnecessary conflict with Russia itself. And on the other side, because the main aim, as I said, was to prevent the establishment of Iran in Syria and the shipment of arms to Hezbollah, and not to target Iranians. Because in the Israeli calculation, that would also sort of result in a direct confrontation with Iran that they wanted to prevent. So what I want to say was that basically, despite T4 being, an incident of direct confrontation and targeting of Iranian personnel and IRGC officers, that was an exception, not a rule still. But the next phase happened actually since the start of the war in Ukraine, because Russia, on one hand, started to focus most of its intelligence and military resources on Ukraine, and on the other hand, Russia's own relationship with Iran started to deepen. So they both meant that Iran started to basically fill the vacuum, not as such vacuum, but basically it was in the form of a collaboration between Iran and Russia, in the sense that Russia would abandon some of less strategically important places in Syria, handing them over to Iran and its allies. And that resulted in, on one hand, kind of decreased bandwidth and capacity for Russia to continue playing the escalator between Iran and Syria, and of course, less trust on the Israeli side to basically work with Russia as a mediator. And of course, given Israel's position regarding the war in Ukraine, basically supporting Ukraine, Moscow's relations with Tel Aviv started to sort of, go toward sort of conflicting, or better to say, started to see tensions. So in that sense, what we started to see since 2022 was that, or it appeared that Israel still try to avoid human casualties on the Iranian side as much as possible. But because of this, decreased role of Russia, and of course, the urge on the Israeli side basically to double down on this campaign in order to basically prevent Iran from using that opportunity to fill Russia's place. Then the campaign between the wars basically intensified. And then finally, and this is where this is what basically caused us to end up in the current situation. It was the October 7 Hamas attack and the developments that came afterward, because what October 7 did to Israel's threat perception was that they, and this is an argument that you can see quite often, that they started to basically see themselves effectively at war with Iran and its allies in the so-called axis of resistance. So in that sense, the argument emerged that, we are already at war, so it wouldn't make sense to basically stick to those prior reservations or considerations. So that was one thing. Another thing was basically, of course, in the same way, the Israeli attempt to make Iran directly responsible for the activities of its allies and proxies, regardless of the extent of their autonomy, because obviously you can see that even the Israelis have admitted that Iran didn't have prior knowledge of the October 7 attack, but that was the way they started to react. And the third element was that, especially during the first 2 months of the war in Gaza, because again, the Israelis were afraid that it might allow Iran an opportunity, give Iran an opportunity to further establish itself. They started indiscriminately bombing the airports and all the main connection routes, being the airports or highways, etc., to basically paralyze the sort of potential connections that Iran could use to send arms. But the two first considerations that I mentioned, in the sense that making Iran responsible, that was what prompted Israel to embark on a kind of very significant change in its strategy, and starting to target IRGC officials and commanders. So what happened was that basically the IRGC commanders and generals, so ranking generals, became the main targets. Not, for example, like 2018, that they were collateral damages. They were the main targets. So looking at this whole thing from the Iranian perspective, it was seen as Israel basically step by step changing the rules of the game, changing the rules of engagement, going out of the so-called gray zone and pushing Iran towards a sort of direct confrontation. So I could see that on the Iranian side, they were still undecided whether it is a so-called trap by Netanyahu to bring Iran into war and distract attention from Gaza. That happened anyway. But on the other side, those who were arguing in favor of not allowing Israel to change the rules of the game their argument prevailed, and then Iran decided to do what it did in attacking Israel basically by hundreds of missiles and drones. So from this perspective, actually, what Iran did was, in their own perspective, was to push Israel towards the old rules of engagement, the rules of engagement that they both knew and they would comfortably play with. That's very important in understanding, for example, why Iran informed Israel and the United States beforehand through neighboring countries, or why it didn't respond, at least so far, to the latest Israeli strike in Isfahan. So in that sense, the attack in Isfahan, because it was seen, again, on the Iranian side as well, as a warning, it didn't cause any fatalities. It seems to be kind of Israel back to the gray zone. So I would conclude by saying that from now on, it depends on whether the both sides have basically tacitly agreed on the new rules of engagement, or to go back to the old rules of engagement and to stick by playing in the gray zone. The risks are higher than before. The stakes are higher than before, obviously, because that kind of threshold of getting engaged directly against each other, that has already passed. But this is the sort of situation that we are in. So thank you. I stop here.
Thank you so much, Ahmedjan. Thanks for sticking to time. You're right on time. So there are a number of questions, and I think I'll go through some of them, and I will assign a speaker to respond to it, but others feel free to also jump in if you have something to add and share your perspective. There are some questions that we have received by email, and I'd like to pose them to Professor Kamrava, if that's okay. It's looking at the role of Qatar in this new dynamic and the new tension, more than tension now, confrontation between Iran and Israel. What role does Qatar play, and what role can other countries play? The question refers to countries in the global south. So if you could perhaps reflect on that. There's a follow-up question to that, since I'm putting you on the spot, Professor Kamrava. The follow-up question is, how does Iran's good neighborly policy fare, and how is it going to be impacted by the policies of supporting proxies and IRGC's activities in the region? So two-pronged question, really.
Yeah, thank you. Iran's relationship with Qatar has been extremely cordial, extremely warm and friendly, and extremely superficial. The Qataris want to maintain relations with Iran, but not necessarily to the extent that would antagonize or jeopardize their very close security collaboration and cooperation with the United States. So and in this ongoing genocide, the Qataris have their own dog in the race. What they're trying to do, they got involved in the mediation between Israel and Hamas. And a couple of days ago, we heard the Qatari foreign minister, prime minister, threaten to kind of abandon the negotiations, mediation efforts, and kind of pull out. So the Qataris have their own concerns right now. For them, last thing they want is additional tensions with Iran or anyone else. They're under tremendous pressure in the US Congress, with very influential congressmen coming out and accusing Qatar of bankrolling Hamas and not exerting enough pressure to get the remaining 20, 30 Israeli hostages released. And so, and what I found quite interesting was that for the first time, the Iranians actually indicated to the Qataris that Al Udeid base here in Doha is fair game, and that if the base was used for an attack on Iran by the United States, they would attack back. And that in the past, during even the George Bush administration, the Iranians kind of didn't so directly indicate that Al Udeid or American presence here in Qatar was fair game. So as we've heard from our distinguished panelists, the rules of the game are in the process of changing. And so those relations might be changing. Supporting proxies, that's a really good question. Part of, Iran's proxies are the ones in the neighborhood, in the region, are in Iraq, basically, in terms of Iran's immediate neighbors. And Iran's relationship with Iraq has been subject to dynamics other than the good neighbor relations. There have been other kind of political, security and economic relationships that underlie the closeness between Tehran and Baghdad, and are not necessarily subject to the developments having to do with Iranian proxies or non-state actors in Iraq. This was one of the main sticking issues between Tehran and Riyadh, Iran's support for the Houthis. But then once the Houthis and Saudi Arabia themselves entered into a ceasefire agreement, that appears to have been resolved.
Thank you so much. If there are no other comments by other panelists, I'll move on to the next question. Okay, so next question is about Iran's standing. Once Iran, as you have all indicated, Iran has been quite critical of the Abraham Accord, has even pointed that those countries that did sign the Abraham Accord were betraying the Muslim world. That message seems to have resonated in the Arab streets. Now with the conflict in Gaza and then direct confrontation between Iran and Israel, Iran's message, also they refer to Iran feeling self-assertive and quite strong in its position. And that feeling might be supported and fed by sentiments in the Arab streets and throughout the Muslim world. So now the question is, are we witnessing the rise of a Muslim bloc? Are we seeing a third bloc emerging? The Western, the Chinese, and now a Muslim bloc. Also, what do you think about that? Need to unmute.
Yes, thank you very much for that question, because I think it's a highly interesting one. I don't think there is a new third Islamic bloc in the making. I think when we look at the kind of de-escalation, managing conflict among Arab states together with Iran, what Professor Kamrawa has just very aptly coined as being kind of superficial in many regards, I think this still holds. So what we see is a certain tendency to de-escalate, to try to manage conflict, particularly because both sides or different sides saw that this kind of escalation is going to be very costly, and that there's not the same amount of extra regional support in terms of the United States support, for instance, for Saudi Arabia and others, as there used to be or as was expected. But managing conflict, trying to de-escalate, is not the same thing as building an alliance, as having common norms, standards, interests, as not being competitive in the geopolitical sphere. So I think we are quite far away from having this kind of Islamic bloc of different powerful players that would include, let's say, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and so on and so forth. Plus, from Iran's perspective, and I think also this holds for Arab Gulf states, for instance, they're not decoupling from the West. I mean, just because there's a normalization agreement with Iran, this is not entering any kind of starting phase of an alliance with Iran. They very much are still aligned with Western powers, with Western security, and they still see Iran as a major threat. So I think this is a shiny kind of thing to have this agreement, and I would say this agreement has some substance to it. We've seen some de-escalatory results of this agreement that are important, but they do not constitute a substantial kind of basis for further cooperation. And from the perspective of Iran, this is not even in Iran's interest or what they are seeking. They're very clearly looking to Russia and China as they see them as main kind of drivers with the capacity, potentially also the will to shape global order, to have a bloc that is really impactful in terms of international order. This is not the kind of impact that you could just build with having Pakistan, let's say Oman and other countries joining in, or having this kind of third bloc. So Iran is very much eyeing the bigger kind of global powers to have an enduring, sustainable impact on a post-Western world. And then maybe in the future, sometime down the line, you will have other possibilities for further alignment. But I don't see the will or the capacity on either side to build some sort of third bloc that would be able or willing to compete with the Western and, let's say, a Chinese, Russian-led bloc.
Thank you so much for that. Right. Our next question looks at Iran's connection with Hamas and Houthis. And the question that comes up, and this is aimed at Dr. Azizi, the question that comes up is that, okay, Iran didn't order the Hamas attack on 7th of October, but what does that mean for the partnership and for the relationship? Does it mean that Hamas can do anything they want, and then by the fact that they are aligned with Iran, they would drag into a conflict that's not out of Iran's making? And the same question might apply to how Houthis behave. Iran's relationship and patronage of Houthis, does that make Iran complicit in Houthi activity? So, and where do Iranian leadership, where do they draw the line and say something is in our strategic, national / ideological interest and something is not? Where is that line?
That's a very important question, and it has to do with how this network of axis of resistance has evolved, especially since 2020. Because, you know, to put it in a nutshell, the way the axis of resistance was built under the auspices of the person of Qasem Soleimani was different than how it is right now. So what Soleimani built over the years was a sort of hierarchical network, very solid in terms of the hierarchy with himself on top, and then, you know, local commanders in each of the target countries in charge of coordination. But after his assassination in 2020, especially for the first few months, and especially in Iraq, Iran started to see a vacuum. And the new head of the Quds Force, General Ghani, he couldn't basically, you know, play the same role as Soleimani did. And then there was a need for Hassan Nasrallah to come in, and the role of Hezbollah within the whole axis basically elevated. So what we started to see since then was the axis getting decentralized, in the sense that, you know, the different members of the axis, you know, enjoy more autonomy, at the same time as ideologically and also in terms of financial and military support being reliant on Iran. So what you just mentioned in terms of Hamas and the Houthis basically doing activities that may be against Iranian interests, that was what we warned about 2 years ago in an article in War on the Rocks. I would refer that to if anybody is interested. How the access got decentral, I will link it to the chat, and how it is impacting. So that was a danger which was already there. So the function of the axis of resistance in Iran's regional strategy overall has become sort of contradictory. On one hand, more autonomy for the members, especially for actors like the Houthis, have basically allowed Iran to expand, I mean, at the same time as those actors remaining Iran's allies, have helped Iran basically expand its regional influence. But at the same time, because you know, the whole axis is still in a transitional phase, not fully decentralized, not fully autonomous, not fully proxies, Iran still is not immune of the repercussions of those activities. So I think and I would expect that after the war in Gaza, Iran would enter into, and I already see signs of it, into some sort of revising of this of the sort of relationship. So that's how I see it. I mean, the negative repercussions of the activities for Iran are there, but this doesn't mean that you know they are kind of Iran is behind every activity that they are doing.
Okay. I think we lost the connection a little bit towards the end, but we'll press on. I'm going to come back to Professor Kamrava on a question of rationality. How should we best describe Iran? Does the do the recent events that have happened the past few weeks, do they point to Iran as a rational nation state, or do they highlight the fact that ideology is an important factor in decision making? So how would you view Iran as a state?
What we've seen consistently in Iranian foreign policy is foreign policy in the Islamic Republic's foreign policy that is based on national interests, and ideology has taken a backseat. Ideology has been used instrumentally, identity has been used instrumentally when it has served strategic interests. So, for example, when it comes to relations with Hezbollah, ideology has been used strategically and instrumentally to buttress Iran's larger strategic interests. So one of the interesting things we see, I alluded to tensions between Iran and Azerbaijan. And in Azerbaijan's conflict with Armenia, Azerbaijan being a Shia majority state and Armenia being a Christian majority state, Iran has been consistently supportive of Armenia to the point that at some point, Iran and Azerbaijan nearly came to blows because of it. So ideology has been used quite instrumentally in the service of strategy. So, of course, every state articulates its foreign policy in terms of ideals, but then the practice of foreign policy changes. We often hear, for example, respect for human rights coming out of, as an example, Germany, whereas Germany has now been taken to ICJ for its complicity in genocide. And so there's always a lack of consistency between ideology and the actual practice of foreign policy. And we've seen that in the case of Iran as well.
Thank you so much. I'm moving on to Dr. Zamerirad, keeping that order going. You seem to be on a roll here. So the question is about Iran's forward defense. How should we understand Iran's decision to engage with Israel? Is this a form of forward defense? And how can we relate that, whether we can, to Houthis' behavior and the attacks on shipping in the Red Sea?
I believe the question in the chat was kind of, did Iran give up on forward defense now? Is it going to give up on it? Is there a change in kind of, let's say, long-held principles in Iran's security and defense doctrine? And forward defense has, of course, always been a main kind of attribute building stone in Iran's defense policies, at least in how they projected their security interests by claiming and saying these are our legitimate security interests. We don't have the kind of conventional means to defend ourselves within our own borders, particularly because of sanctions, clear limitations in how we can modernize our own armed forces. So in a way, we need to defend ourselves outside of our borders. And part of this forward defense is the axis of resistance, is this idea to have non-state, sub-state actors helping Iran, bringing a certain deterrence capability outside of Iran that needs to be credible in order to function as this kind of defense mechanism. And Iran has not given up on forward defense. In fact, we still see the whole mechanism in place. Obviously, what we've seen from Iran in these past years and decades in the region went far beyond just defense, went far beyond forward defense. So a lot of it is, of course, part of the kind of state propaganda that we see, that we are just acting in the interest of our own defense. But what we've seen in the region throughout, and this is also the perception in a number of Arab states, is that Iran went far beyond just taking defensive measures and actively undermining statehood in a number of neighboring states, having a stronger presence. They're influencing internal kind of dynamics in politics, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Lebanon. So forward defense, I think, is a kind of term that we need to be very careful of. But I think there are other areas of Iran's, let's say, security principles that have been shifting far more interestingly. And after the attack of Iran against Israel, we've heard it all throughout Iranian elites that the era of strategic patience is over. And I think this is an important and interesting kind of principle to declare as being over, whether this is serious or not. The fact that Iran is saying that strategic patience is no longer a guiding principle for us means that, and we saw that in this attack, and Dr. Azizi already alluded to it, that the threshold has been crossed. Iran has been openly and directly attacking Israel without any kind of possible deniability, without any kind of strategic patience. So without waiting for, let's say, a better window of opportunity, playing the long game, trying to, find other areas of retaliation. They've given up on this in this particular case. And it is now a part of their kind of restoration of plausible and credible deterrence to say that this no longer holds, meaning that from this point forward, at least, the possibility of a direct attack will always be on the table. That's the message that they're trying to send, and that's an important one. So here we see some changes in the kind of principles that we've seen over the years, as Professor Komrova has also said, the changing rules of engagement, the changing rules of the game. But I think, as we already heard also, this is a transitional phase. So it's far too early to say how it will really end up and where we will freeze. But I think crossing this threshold and giving up on this principle, at least with this attack, are significant moments in time, and they have changed the entire dynamic, at least, of the conflict that we've seen so far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zamir-Irad. I'm going to refer the next question to you, Dr. Azizi, and that's about, I guess, an impending arms race in the Gulf region. What happened with Iran's missile and drone attack on Israel was a demonstration of the efficiency of the Iron Dome. Israel defense system worked well, and US support in shooting down various drones and missiles worked well. Granted, they had advanced warning, so they were prepared for it, but they had the means to defend Israeli territory for the most part. Only a few missiles got through out of 300. So that's quite remarkable. And the question is, does this mean that other states in the Gulf would now look quite keenly to the US protection umbrella and demand that level of support in case of conflict with Iran or perhaps other states? And I'm going to add another angle to this question, and that is the future of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Should we worry about the security and safety of shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz? Is it going to affect oil shipments to global market? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, let me start by saying, I mean, when you look at the performance of the Israeli air defense in the recent Iran attack, of course, most of the missiles were intercepted. I mean, the rate was said to be 99%, and then they corrected it to 84%. But it's very important to note that, as you also alluded to, that it was mainly thanks to prior warning and also with the help of intelligence sharing from the Gulf and active participation. Despite that, if you can you hear me?
Yes, but
Yeah,
it is
so-
a bit shaky.
Yeah, I mean, it started to snow.
Okay, so I might ask you to go on
Side, and
mute.
that's usually so.
Okay,
If,
thank you. So I don't know if Professor Kamrava or Dr. Zamirira, if you'd like to answer that question or think about that question about the safety of shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz and the attractiveness of the Iron Dome.
Dr. Zamirira, go ahead, please.
I think you have to leave soon, right? So please go ahead. No ta'aruf.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, there, the first part of the question was arm race in the region. I'm not sure how much more of an arm race there can be. If you look at CIPRI data, this region every year they're breaking new records of purchases of armaments from the United States and from others, and enormous percentages of the national budget is being allocated to armaments. And incidentally, if you look at the same data for Iran, CIPRI data, for example, it pales in comparison. So the arms race has been going on, and I don't see any reason for it to be reduced anytime in the near future. Also, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, I think the Iranians will continue to indirectly indicate that they can block the Strait of Hormuz if they want. And I think they have the capacity. It's not that difficult, that technologically difficult, and they might do it. But I really doubt if they would do it, because a lot of their own port facilities are located west of the Hormuz for the time being. So a lot of Iranian shipping goes through the Hormuz as well, and the ports to the east of the Hormuz don't have the same capacity. So I sincerely doubt they would kind of blockade shipping, but of course, from a strategic perspective, they'll maintain the threat.
If I may just add to that, I think the very fact that Iran is capable of creating an entire blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is a very important part of its deterrence ability. And now with the kind of expansion of the axis of resistance and the so-called Houthis being part of it, Iran now also has the ability to at least obstruct trade routes and shipping routes in the Red Sea as well. So if you have the kind of capability to have some major obstruction impact on international shipping routes, then that's a very essential part of your deterrence, I think, abilities here. And this is what Iran was after. So, I mean, in the past, we also thought it would not be in Iran's interest to obstruct shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. And yet we saw it happen on the change, strategic considerations and on the changed kind of political positions here. It might not be the most likely thing. It might not be in Iran's interest, but it has the capacity to strike, if you will, at two very core vital points for international shipping. And they're very much aware of this kind of capability and are going to use it as a very, very strong deterrent.
Thank you so much. We are coming towards the end of our session. I'm going to try Dr. Azizi again to see perhaps if you could offer some concluding remarks to this session. Any final thoughts you'd like to share? Hopefully your internet holds.
I hope the internet works. I mean, you cannot
Go
believe
ahead.
it's happening in Germany, but anyway. So thank you to the two distinguished speakers, our colleagues. I really learned a lot. What I want to say, just to as a follow-up to my initial intervention, is that basically it's, when you look at the recent engagements between Iran and Israel, it's been more or less about setting new rules of engagement. But the problem is that both sides now seem not to be deterred, and that was the message that they sent through, the missile attack and also by Isfahan attack. So that's basically the danger that we are facing right now. And what I want to add actually is that both sides actually started to increasingly see the weaknesses of each other. Like for Iran, it was, although, as I said, most of the missiles were intercepted, but that was basically thanks to the collaboration of Israeli allies. And on the Iran side also, it became quite evident that the air defenses, even the S-300s, are not sufficient for deterring an Israeli strike. So whether understanding these weaknesses will result in some sort of relative calm or strategic stability in the confrontation, or the two sides are going to build on them to further escalate, when the conflict in other areas kind of increase, then that is very important in the future developments of the region and the overall stability.
Thank you so much, Dr. Azizi. Our time has come to an end. I do like to thank all our speakers, our esteemed panel of experts, Professor Mehran Kamrava, Dr. Azadeh Zamirirad, Dr. Hamid Reza Azizi, and a special thanks to the Middle East Council on Global Affairs for facilitating this discussion. Obviously, the rules of the game have changed. We have entered a new era in relations to Iran, in relation to Iran's foreign policy making and perhaps security thinking. So this is somewhat concerning, very concerning, especially if you're sitting in Doha. But hopefully, and we pray that things calm down and we don't see further escalation. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. A recording of this session will be available on YouTube, and everyone will receive the link by email. Thanks so much for joining us.